Is this a global impact?
Yes, it will have a global impact, and it will impact on the global economy, I think, in two offsetting ways.
Which source of inflation worries you the most?
From an international perspective now, is food price inflation.
So in your opinion, how should central banks respond to the current situation?
I think they should be very careful not to overreact.
今天我们请到瑞士盈丰银行首席经济学家 Stefan Gerlach 来解读一下俄罗斯和乌克兰局势以及对于全球经济的影响。Mr. Gerlach, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
According to your report, the crisis between Russia and Ukraine will have two offsetting effects on the economy. So how to understand two offsetting effects? Is this a global impact?
Yes, it will have a global impact, and it will impact on the global economy, I think, in two offsetting ways. The most obvious way is that it will push up energy prices in particular, and a number of other prices, and this will lead to higher inflation across the world. And the second impact is that these higher energy prices will raise firms' production costs and tend to restrict firms' supply of goods. It will slow the global economy. So we'll have more inflation and less economic activity.
You said this crisis will boost inflation. Oil price hits new high since 2008. Gold tops $2,000, and other metal and food prices rise sharply as well. Which source of inflation worries you the most?
We have to remember that oil prices very often rise a lot and fall a lot, and then they sort of stop. They stop moving, and then after some time, the inflationary impact disappear. What I think is particularly worrisome from an international perspective now is food price inflation. Unfortunately, it will be relatively less developed economies that import a lot of food. We know that there's a very strong negative relationship between the amount of food and the economy consumes, so the importance of food in the consumer price basket and the level of economic development in that economy. Poorer economies, they tend to have a very large part of the consumer price index are food prices. And if you have a country that's not that well developed, that has a lot of food in the consumer price index, and that imports a lot of wheat, the effect could be very substantial. And I'm particularly here worried about countries in the Middle East and Northern Africa, and so on.
How serious will inflation be? What is the worst possible impact on global economy?
Oil prices have risen very, very much, as you noted. But the world economy has become less energy dependent than it was 20 or 30 years ago. So that will tend to mitigate the effect. Some countries will rely more on imported oil than others. So it will have an effect that will vary across countries. The key thing here is really for how long will oil prices stay high and how high will they rise? And that's just something we cannot really know right now. It depends on how this crisis will develop.
In your career, have you seen any other situations that can be comparable to the current one?
I think there are a few examples like this. Of course, we had the first really large global oil shock in 1973 and also in 1979. And those had extraordinarily large impact on inflation. Also in developed economies, much of Western Europe had inflation rates of 15 or 20%. And that led to very, very severe recession as companies' production costs surged when energy prices and oil prices picked up. The world is different now than it was from 50 years ago. In particular, modern economies use less energy in producing output. So I don't think we will get to that situation again. But of course, there could be individual economies that are much more affected than others. And some economies will do relatively well. For instance, so far we have seen very little inflation picking up here in Switzerland. And one reason for that is that a large part of the energy needs in Switzerland actually come from hydroelectric plants There are, of course, oil isn't used to generate electricity here, and therefore energy prices have stayed low, and the consumer price index has stayed low. Some countries will do well, some countries will do very poorly. Unfortunately, we can just hope that these price tensions are resolved as quickly as possible.
Do you think the conflict between Russia and Ukraine will cause a financial crisis?
No, I don't think so. One reason for that is that I think after the global financial crisis in 2008, central banks, monetary authorities, financial regulators across the world realized that the world was a much riskier place than they had thought. And following the financial meltdown in 2008, which incidentally was much more severe outside of Asia. It was really a European, Northern American financial crisis in many ways. Regulators, central banks, monetary authorities have worked very hard at making the financial system, the broader financial system, more resilient than in the past. And I think they have made a lot of headway in doing this. There's, of course, always the risk in some countries of property markets and so on, but also those can be risks there can be limited by appropriate government policies.
Many central banks have already tightened monetary policies. Now the market is looking at US Federal Reserve, which has signaled a 25 basis point hike later this month. You have extensive experience at central banks. So in your opinion, how should central banks respond to the current situation?
I think they should be very careful not to overreact. I think the Fed is now raising interest rates, but not because of the developments we've seen in the last 2 weeks. Rather, the US economy is doing very well. The unemployment rate is down to 3.8%. That is full employment. I think the Fed has said that in past years. So that is full employment. And if the economy is at full employment, interest rates shouldn't be at zero. So I think they are trying us to move the economy or move interest rates back to a neutral level, if you like, and they're not reacting to current events. And I think they should continue to do this. So I expect the Fed will raise interest rates gradually during the course of this year, 4, 5, 6 times. Where different commentators have different views. I think other central banks who will see a spike in inflation because of the developments in the Ukraine and Russia, I think they should be careful not to overreact, because it's not at all clear how long these inflationary effects will stay around. Monetary policy actually impacts on inflation with a very long lag. Depends a bit on what economy you're in, but as a good rule of thumb, tighter monetary policy this year slows the economy next year and reduces inflation in 2 years' time. So if you think that inflation in 2 years' time will be back where you started from, that these events in Russia and the Ukraine will not impact on inflation for 2 years. Well, in that situation, I'm not sure you want to react at all. So I think central banks will do what the rest of us are doing. They will wait, sit calmly and see what is happening, and they will try not to overreact to the situation. Some countries, of course, may be more exposed because they suffer an exchange rate depreciation. Some countries are already lagging behind a little bit on monetary policy. I'm thinking about Latin America and some Eastern European countries that have been raising interest rates repeatedly since last year. But more broadly, I think the Fed and the ECB and so on, they will not be too perturbed. They will not react very strongly to these recent developments.
In particular, how will this conflict affect the economies of Russia and Ukraine?
It's terrible. I mean, it's obvious that the economy in Ukraine will suffer a very, very large recession. It is also very bad news for the Russian economy, because the sanctions that have been put on Russia will have a very large impact on the Russian economy. And they are not able to trade freely with the rest of the world. Their financial links with the rest of the world have been partially cut, not completely, but been partially cut. That doesn't lead to a collapse in the Russian economy, but it means that the Russian economy will be growing at a much, much lower rate in the next couple of years. I assume that actually the Russian economy will contract a bit, but not a very large number. But it will be like running against the wind. So this will have a large detrimental impact on the European economies, in particular the economies in the eastern part of Europe, Poland, and the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on. This is not good news.